Hello everyone and welcome back. I hope you're having a wonderful day. In today's photo editing tutorial, regardless of your editing software, you'll discover the top 3 editing mistakes I see with HDR images and some bonus editing tips along the way. Plus, if you stay until the end, I'm going to share the biggest problem with creating HDR images, whether you're hand holding or using a tripod, and how to fix it. My name is Chris Parker and I'm a professional landscape and wildlife photographer. I create weekly videos with pro tips for improving your photography and editing skills. Subscribe if you want to see more. All right, so most of the HDR images that I create are done with a tripod. However, for this location, which is Lower Antelope Canyon in Arizona, tripods were not allowed. Plus, our group had around 15 people or so, and another group of the same size was right behind us. So it was challenging enough with the large dynamic range of the canyon. So I had to get creative. First, I went with a high ISO of 1600, and I'm comfortable with the amount of noise my Nikon Z8 creates at that level. My next decision was depth of field, and most of the images I created here were at an aperture of f11. However, for some reason, I chose f8 for this one. And I used my trusty 20mm lens that I actually dropped off a cliff once upon a time, and I used it to create the 4 different exposures for this image. And the first one here was shot at 1/125th of a second, and I doubled the exposure for each of the additional shots. And in hindsight, I probably should have created one more at 1/60th of a second for the deep shadows. Fortunately, with today's AI technology, I was able to recover many of the details in the shadows and remove the digital noise that appeared after brightening those tonal values. And I'm going to share the steps I used to fix the digital noise and enhance the details later. First, I know some of you have questions about creating an HDR image without a tripod, like how do you line them up during the editing process? So let me first share the first step, which starts in camera. So the technique I used was pretty simple. When you don't have a tripod, you have to become the tripod, or find a surface to place your camera on, like a wall or the ground or a hard surface. Now for these images, I had to become the tripod. So basically all you have to do, elbows in tight, hand under your lens, and then press your forehead against the viewfinder. This one doesn't have one, of course, but pressing it against your forehead will allow you to create a more stabilized position. And if you can, in this case, because of the canyon walls, I was able to use the walls and lean against them for additional stabilization. So the key to creating HDR images while hand holding is to create multiple exposures really fast, which is the hard part of bracketing your exposures without a tripod. If the multiple images you create are too far off, your editing software might not be able to align them, or if they do, it can cause a huge problem that we'll tackle at the end. Now, most digital cameras offer an auto exposure bracketing feature where you can fire off multiple shots in a second or two, which will minimize any movement and makes it easier for your software to align each image. So look for auto bracketing, BKT, or AEB, which stands for auto exposure bracketing, in your menu or somewhere on the body. You can then choose between 3 or more exposures, then make sure you're set to continuous shooting mode. Now all you have to do is get into position, compose, and hold the shutter release button down, and your camera will automatically change the camera settings for each exposure. Okay, now you have to merge those images with your editing software of choice. Most editing apps like Lightroom, Affinity Photo, Luminar Neo, and others have what is known as HDR merge, or it might be called HDR photo merge. Either way, you're going to select all the exposures and activate photo merge. In Lightroom, you can right-click on the images and choose HDR merge from here, If you're not using Lightroom, I've included guides for merging HDR images for other software in the description below. Now, depending on your software, you may have similar features to these and possibly more. But for the basics, you should have an auto align, deghost, and possibly an auto settings feature. So you should use the auto align feature to let your editing software auto-magically align your multiple exposures. However, if you moved slightly while hand holding, you'll get what looks like a ghost or ghosting effect, but you can still get the ghosting effect when using a tripod. So since I did an amazing job with this image, I don't have to do any deghosting. Later on, we're gonna switch to another image that has ghosting, and I'll show you what it looks like, how to fix it, and what happens if you don't. All right, so next, you have to decide if you want Lightroom or whatever you're using to auto-magically edit your image with AI technology. I like to use this feature as a starting point since it's non-destructive. So using this or not is entirely up to you and how you prefer to edit. So in Lightroom, I like to organize my library of images to create a stack of all the HDR files. So let's merge them and get into the mistakes to avoid when editing. So real quick, the images are now grouped together or stacked, and when you click on this number, it will collapse them into a single view. So it just cleans up the library a little bit, and then clicking again will expand and show all of those images. Now, after merging in Lightroom, you'll get a DNG file, which actually causes a huge problem in Lightroom that I'll explain in a moment. However, there's another problem you may notice that is easy to fix. In fact, your software may auto-magically fix it. So in the crop tool here, you'll notice that there's some white space to the left and top. Now, this happens when your images don't line up perfectly and your editing software has to make a compromise and bend or tweak the images so that they line up. In Lightroom, it auto crops out the empty areas. All right, now let's take a look at the number one mistake when it comes to editing HDR images. So each one of these images have the exact same edits applied except for one key edit. And as you can see, each image here looks different. The first and second are very close, but the second has more contrast and the colors are more saturated and vibrant, which makes it look fake. Now, the third image here is even worse. So HDR images get a bad rap because of the overprocessed colors and contrast, and choosing the wrong profile is part of the problem. So for this final edit, I used the camera neutral profile. The second image has the Adobe color, and the third is using the landscape profile. Now, depending on your software, it might default to Adobe color, or if you shoot primarily landscapes, you might have chosen that profile in camera. And if you set up your software to use that as a default, then your HDR images are going to look unnatural from the beginning. Now, if you'd like to learn more about camera profiles, why I recommend using a neutral profile, and how to set them up as the default during the import process, let me know in the comments. Now, another question you might have is, can I just tone down the color saturation, vibrancy, and contrast while editing? Yes, you can. However, starting with neutral requires less editing and will help minimize over editing. So choosing the right profile makes editing HDR easier. That being said, you can still end up with an overprocessed image as you edit the file. So let's go over the edits I used for this one and some pro tips to avoid over editing. Now, when it comes to editing HDR images, I find for best results, less is more. And this image included the least amount of edits that I've done for any of my HDR images. The only adjustments I've made are the basics or the tonal values. And you may remember that when I merged the files, I used the auto edit feature, which are the same settings you'll get when you click on the auto edit button here. And I'm confident your editing software of choice also has an AI auto feature. So go ahead and use it. It's a great starting point. Now, there are 3 settings that seem to be always adjusted with the AI editing feature, and that is contrast, vibrance, and saturation. Now, I'm not a big fan of the contrast slider and prefer to use the texture, clarity, and dehaze, and sometimes the tone curve to add contrast. So I'm going to go ahead and double click on contrast to reset that. Now, I'm going to do the same with vibrance and saturation, since both boost the colors unnaturally and is a sure sign of an image that has been over edited, at least for this HDR image. Now, texture, clarity, and dehaze are a great way to precisely add contrast along different types of detail, and it also gives the impression that the image is sharper. However, if you go too far, then it's going to look unnatural. So let's go ahead and reset both of these, and I'll explain why I use them. All right, so at this point, I find the areas in the shade to be too dark. Now, one option is to use a mask to target the brightness where I want it, which is something I do for the majority of my images. However, masking those areas is not something that can be done auto-magically with the AI masks, since there is no defined subject, sky, background, etc. So using a brush and making sure I stay within the confines of the shadow is going to be time-consuming. Instead, what the clarity adjustment will do is add contrast along the mid-size details, increase sharpness, and make those details brighter at the same time. And you'll see how the image gets brighter in some areas that the clarity is targeting. So you can only brighten the tonal values so much before you start to clip the whites and highlights. Now, these 3 options aren't targeting a tonal value. Instead, it's more of a granular target of the details in your image based on the size of those details. So dehaze is going to boost the contrast more than the other 2, since it's targeting larger textures, and the colors will also become more vibrant, which is why you have to be careful not to overdo it with, well, actually any of them. All right, now let's circle back to ghosting, which is the biggest mistake if neglected, because it's going to lower the quality of your image. Now, previously, I showed you what happens when your software auto-aligns your image and why you need to crop it. Now, in this image, during the alignment process, it had to make a huge adjustment of each image to try and align all the details. However, while shooting, I moved too much and the images can't be aligned properly. All right, so real quick, in this image, you can see 2 dark anomalies. Those are actually people. And for this image, I used a long shutter speed of 15 seconds. And because they didn't stand still, they look like ghosts since they moved within the frame. The same thing happens when you have multiple images that don't line up. Without the help of your editing software to fix it, you'll end up with a blue line along the edges like this, or it will create a ghost-like effect. Now, the majority of HDR merging software has a deghosting filter built in, and depending on the severity of the ghosting, it will require more or less intensity for deghosting. So the red overlay shows where ghosting is going to occur if you don't fix it. Now, most of the time, I use the maximum setting since it's not going to alter the image in any other way if there isn't as much ghosting. However, if I were to select the lowest setting, you'll see, or you'll notice, the deghosting effect isn't as aggressive and will only fix it within this area compared to a larger portion with the high option. So let's go ahead and merge them with these settings, and then we're going to compare the results. Okay, as you can see, the image was fixed and it doesn't have the ghosting or that blue line this time. Okay, so in Lightroom, if you want to use the AI denoise feature, you can't, at least for DNG and JPEG files. If you'd like to learn more about my preferred method for removing digital noise and sharpening that I use on all my images, watch this video tutorial next.